In the last section we looked at how to use Excel as a database, and we looked at some incredibly powerful features including pivot tables. In this section we're going to look at how we can take our summarized data and express it graphically using charts. A chart is effectively just that, a graphical representation of data. And we use charts to enable us to see trends in data and patterns in data that we cannot see just by looking directly at the numbers. So let's get started by creating some charts. There are a number of ways to create charts. Let's start with one of the most simple methods, and that is to take a table of data, click onto my table, go to the Insert tab, and choose a chart. There is a huge variety of different charts, but for the time being I'm just going to use the Excel feature Recommended Chart. With this feature, Excel automatically analyzes the table of data and decides what kind of chart is most appropriate. As I don't want to delve into the individual charts, I will just allow Excel to recommend a standard chart for me. To create the chart, I just click on my Recommended Charts, and Excel will give me its suggested chart option. In this case, a clustered column chart. Notice Excel gives me a few other variations that I can use. But for now, I'm just going to keep with the straightforward format of the clustered column. From here, I simply need to click OK, and my chart is added to the worksheet. I can also add a chart manually. To repeat the process, I again click into my table so that Excel knows where to get the data from. Go to the Insert menu, and this time I'm going to specifically choose a type of chart. In this instance, a stacked column. Excel automatically previews the chart that it's about to add to the page, a very useful feature as it allows you to get a preview of how your data will be expressed and decide if that's how you best want to present it. So we've now seen that we can add charts using the recommended chart and also create charts by manually selecting our preferred chart type. We can also create a chart from raw data, as long as it is expressed in a summary format rather than list format. Let's just remind ourselves of the difference in these types of data. For example, here, this table is a summary table. It is not giving us individual records of how this data is made up, it is a summary. So, for example, the sum of all sales made in the central region by Gill. On the other hand here, our original data source is a list format. It lists each individual record one by one. From list type data sources, we can arrive at summary data type sources. It's summary data that lends itself best to being added to a chart. To add a chart from standard data that isn't part of a table, I will need to tell Excel exactly what range I want to work with. So in this case, I'm going to select the whole table. From here, I can go to the Insert tab, and again pick a given chart type. Let's perhaps try a 3D chart this time. As you can see, once my chart is created, as long as the chart is selected, I can see what data the chart is feeding from. As we go deeper into charts, we'll understand how the column headers and the row headers affect what is presented in the data and how it is presented. Another way to create a chart is to simply add a blank chart to our worksheet and then retrospectively add the data. This is a good exercise as it will allow us to see how the different parts of the chart are made up. To do this, I'll go to my Insert tab and I'll insert a chart. Note that my cursor is on a blank cell and I have no data selected. From here I can choose, for example, another clustered column chart. My chart is of course completely blank because I haven't added any data. So with my blank chart I'll need to use the Select Data feature. And here I'm going to manually feed in the data to the chart. I press the button and a window appears. The easiest way to get started is to use the Chart Data range. I click on my red arrow to pop out and go and select the data. Returning back to the window, I can now see that Excel has automatically recognized the shape of my data. We have what we're calling legend entries, which in this case refers to the column headers. We also have the axis labels, in this case the sales rep. Notice we have an option here to switch rows and columns. If I use this button, the row header data will become the column header data, and the column header data will become the row header. Let's try that and see what happens. I can see those headers have been switched around, but let's click OK and see what's happened to my chart and see how this chart is different from the others I've created. So in my top chart, I can see all the data summarized, including the regions and the sales rep. The sales rep appears as different columns, but the region appears as different parts of that column. Here the sales rep is on the x-axis. On my newly created chart, I have the region on the x-axis, and my series in this case is the sales reps. If I hover over the different columns, I can see which salesperson this information relates to. The final way we can create a chart is using a pivot table. First of all, I'm going to move this existing chart out of the way so I can create space for some new ones. To create a chart from a pivot table, I can either use the Pivot Table tab and go to Pivot Charts, or I can also use the Insert tab to create a chart in the same way as I have done previously. I can directly select one of the predefined chart types from their drop-downs, and I can also use a pivot chart option. Whether I use this button or any of the other buttons, a pivot chart will be created, because my source of data is a pivot table. Pivot tables create pivot charts. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a column chart. I'll take another clustered column. Pivot charts are slightly different from normal charts, in that pivot charts have a much stronger relation to the data source. For example, when I click onto a pivot chart, I see the pivot chart fields. This is a very similar field chooser to the one we get with a pivot table. To demonstrate that, I'm going to click off my chart and onto the pivot table. Here we have pivot table fields, and here we have pivot chart fields, and actually they are the same fields. There are slight differences in the way they are presented. For example, here on the chart they're called legend and series, whereas on my pivot table it's simply called columns. To demonstrate the link between these two, I'm also going to add an additional field to my pivot table, adding region into my column area. Notice that my pivot table has just been updated with the region information now across the column, but also my pivot chart has updated to include the different regions. I also have within a pivot chart the field buttons. These buttons are not present in standard charts, and they give me access to the pivot data, and I'm able to select different pivot data and rearrange it. From here I can automatically apply a filter to my data, for example removing any information relating to the central region. Again, notice as I change the pivot chart, those same changes are reflected in the pivot table. These field buttons can be very useful for customizing your chart, but once you've finished customizing your chart, it's normally best to get rid of them. To do this, we go into our pivot chart tools. To do that, I must select the chart. My contextual tab is loaded. From here, I move to my Analyze tab. I can then move over to my field buttons, and without clicking on the drop-down, I click squarely on the button, and all of the pivot field buttons are toggled off or on. I can also go into the drop-down menu and manually deselect or select specific field buttons. So let's say I'm finished with my chart. I can now click the field button to remove all field buttons. Fantastic. In the next video, we're going to look at choosing different chart options and customizing those charts.